Seeking the wise.
With Aaron and Alexander discussing the Just philosophy.
Covering self-development, emotional processing, conscious relationships, and 5 levels of overall wellness.
Welcome, everybody, to the Wise podcast. It's me, Aaron, and Alexander in the studio along with me, and we're doing another retro version of what we used to do up until about episode 150, when we kind of switched up a little bit and we're a little more creative and started sharing more of our individual paths utilizing the Just philosophy.
Welcome, everybody. It's so good to be back in this old platform and being present with Aaron. We've enjoyed doing the solo recordings as well, but this is a treat for me. I've been looking forward to this, and I enjoy feeding off of Aaron's energy. So let's see where it takes us.
Yeah. So in a personal conversation, we both were just sharing what we've been going through in our lives. And one thing that came up for me a few weeks ago was I've been noticing resistance a lot more, and how subtle it is, but how important it is within doing this work. And Alexander was like, yeah, it's like one of the most important things to get a handle on. But I feel like it's not brought up right away because we're too busy dealing with our triggers, our emotions, our emotional reactions, and those are bigger, and more noticeable. So we're gonna work on our emotional reactions first. But when you kind of reverse engineer everything and you go back to, okay, how did this emotional reaction start? It seems like resistance is at the beginning of most of our triggers, our emotional reactions, our traumas. I mean, we can even go into preferences and things like that.
Yes, I mean, resistance is one of the main keys of the whole philosophy, and its polarity is acceptance. And I've shared that acceptance is probably one of the, if not the most important word in the Just philosophy as well. And again, acceptance doesn't mean condoning or approving of, but what it simply means is I'm not going to carry resistance with this person, place, or thing, or circumstance. And that again doesn't mean that you're a cheerleader for it. It just simply means that you're not going to hold an internal friction, because I want everybody to remember right away that everything on this planet seems to fall under friction as part of the growth process. So I share a lot with my clients and in my classes that if you want something to stop existing, then you stop feeding it. Well, what do you stop feeding it? You stop feeding it resistance. And this is the power of acceptance. And I'm looking so forward to going deep and dissecting these concepts.
Yeah. And, one thing that came up for me was identifying when I'm feeling negative towards something, and looking at my preferences a little bit, and then trying to identify why do I have those preferences. So I think that's, one of the main areas where it started coming up for me, and looking at, is it just a preference because I prefer it? Is it new? Am I being neutral in that preference, where it's just like your famous example, green beans over broccoli? Maybe I just prefer one taste over the other. Or is there, a very, very, very small emotional reaction that I have towards something? Actually, it's something that comes up, that came up for us in an episode, I want to say years ago, was I think we were talking about associations. And I remember saying to you that when I would drive through Pennsylvania, I just got this weird feeling. I think I was asking whether it was, maybe intuition, whether I was picking up on an energy there, or if it was just a preference or a resistance to something that I had an association around. And I think when we discussed it, and now I go back to it, to me, it was an association. It was just the way things looked created a feeling, because I tapped into something in my environment that told me that when things look this way, you should feel this way, or it means this. And And so, it can get a little complex, chasing that web back. But I feel like, yeah, associations are a big part of this, and preferences, and a lot of those can be traced back to resistance versus just a simple I prefer this over this.
Yes, and I want everyone, all our listeners, to remember that there's a teaching in the Just philosophy of learn to live in non-preference. And that doesn't mean that you don't ever have preferences, but it means that you recognize when you do, and that means that you're not taking in the information as clearly as you could. And with those, when those preferences are around or associations, see, it's most people don't understand that our preferences and things that we hold so dear to us many times were just influences in our environment when we were growing up. I remember asking my brother one time if he realized why he drove a Ford truck. And I said, well, your daddy drove a Ford truck. And then I said, do you realize why you have an international tractor? Well, your dad did. Do you realize why you're a Republican? Your dad was. So, see, that wasn't a judgment. It was just that these are things that he was very adamant about supporting, but didn't necessarily understand where the influence came. And see, with influence, judgments are created as well. So, see, associations bring both so called positive associations and so called negative associations. And what I want to ask our listeners to practice actually is to just consider something that you recognize having a preference over, and consider experiencing it from a neutral standpoint, like a child for the first time. And that is getting back to the green beans and the broccoli casserole type of thing, is that, like, yeah, there may be in a period of your time where maybe you were forced to eat green beans when you were growing up, and that created an association with green beans. And then you've just always said now as an adult, oh, I don't eat green beans. Well, realizing that that force, for many people, this is religion too. When they're growing up, they can have a very bad taste in their mouth where religion's concerned because of the way it was presented to them. But that doesn't mean that there's not a message or information in that religion that is useful and beneficial, but they kind of clump it all together. So my request to everybody is find something that you're in resistance to and give it another chance. Maybe give it multiple chances to realize that you as a person have grown older, hopefully grown wiser. Lots of things change, and most people don't give things chances from a conscious point of view. They're just following this subconscious training, and it can open up a whole new world of experiences when you work against these preferences or with them, and give life an opportunity to reintroduce you to something, possibly for the first time from a different perception.
Yeah, for my sisters and I, it was lima beans actually
Okay.
that we have trauma around.
Okay.
Actually, I was talking with my older sister when they came down for my birthday about this very thing, and she was talking about lima beans and how she will not eat them because we were made to sit at the table until we ate the lima beans when we were
Right.
younger, and she took on more trauma than I did around that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, are you able to eat lima beans now, or is it still not one of your preferences?
Like I don't seek them out, but I feel like maybe about 10 years ago I did have some, and they weren't as bad as, when I was a kid.
Yeah, and this is a great opportunity, like when you go to someone's house. Again, if they're serving something like that, then see, it's good to be able to eat it and at least be neutral about it rather than making any kind of stand about it. As just another good self development exercise. And that, yeah, you may not seek it out, but also you don't avoid it possibly if it's available.
Yeah,
And I
well,
think
and
that
when
that's
you're
even a
yeah,
win.
when you're over somebody's house, there's that extra pressure a little bit because you don't really have the freedom to just choose in a way. If you're home, you just do whatever you want. But you're outside your comfort zone. Maybe there's manners involved. We've talked about manners before, and how maybe they're not as conscious as they seem to be made to be in our culture. But there is some consideration too that we do. This person spent time making this, so I'm going to at least try it. you know?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that is considerate, and it shows some growth because it's those preferences are very similar to our emotions. See, when um, many times children are even taught to act differently in public than they do at home, and I think it's possibly more conscious or potentially better to have a consistency there, and instead of that's where manners come in, and manners can get in the way of consciousness because it gets in the way of us being our authentic selves. Now, if a person can have those types of manners like all the time and it is part of who they are, see, then that doesn't distract or take them away from that. But many times people have been taught to act different, so to say, and it can go beyond consideration. It can go into wanting to be accepted. So, see, anybody that has deserving issues or abandonment issues, they will do most anything to be liked or to be accepted. And again, we bring in the word preference here and fear of friction or any type of altercation. So many times people will play a role that's not naturally in their vibration, and then that can create lots of energy drainages. It can even turn into physical illnesses.
Yeah, and I'll just bring up a quick example. Last time I went to a sound journey with you guys, I stayed over at Alexander's, and after the sound journey, I mean, I still think about this night because it was it was awesome. We had some wine. We all, after the show, we sat around, and Elena made us this absolutely delectable meal, and we ate at like midnight.
Mhm.
But it thinking back on it, like the salad was not how I would prefer it. Like I don't usually have tomatoes or feta in my salad, but it was it was more like, well, this is how it was being prepared, so I want to have it exactly how it was intended to be. And it was like I still think about this meal. It was just amazing, especially with the paired with the wine and just the atmosphere of, having just put on a sound journey, and it was a perfect night,
Yeah.
and I still think about it, and I realized that, days, weeks later, I would go out and I would have wine, like, subconsciously, I just started buying wine to try to, like, relive some of that energy, so it was just a great time.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example, like you said, of the salad being fixed, maybe not the way you would fix it, but when it's all together with everything together, it was a different experience. And that's a perfect example of, the acceptance instead of resistance. And so many people will create a resistance right away. And this is common, I think, that upsets a lot of chefs is when people doctor the food before they even take a taste of it. And I can certainly say that I've been guilty of that, but I've also learned that, yeah, there's an art in that, and to respect the artist, at least let your palate experience the way it was intended to be experienced, and then kind of go from there. But that was a wonderful evening, and it was such a wonderful event, a team event that we put on, and great conversation and great food. Yes.
So, let's move back towards resistance, and let's talk about how we can even identify when we are resisting something and when it's just a preference. Like, are there signs that we could mention that most people would be able to identify within themselves? And if you're having an emotional reaction, did it truly start with resistance at some point?
Yeah, well, the first thing with to separate a preference and a resistance is like you can go into sports. I used to be a very avid sports team follower and basketball, baseball, football, had favorite teams. Then I had teams that I didn't like. A lot of that came from association with people that I grew up with and that type of thing. And see, now I can watch any sport and I can find players or plays on both teams that I enjoy, and I enjoy it in a different way. So, see, I used to have resistance to certain teams, certain players, and I was very affected whether my team won or lost. could determine my day or my week. And see, now it comes from a much more general place. So that was like resistance, that I was resistant to certain players, certain teams. And what would happen is if I got in a discussion with somebody that liked a team that I really didn't like, or they didn't like my team, then many times it would be this need to make a stand, and my heart rate would raise, and we would go into this like kind of verbal battle, trying to one up the other person to see who could win the conversation. And something that's just a mild preference is more like the heart rate doesn't necessarily go up, the emotions don't necessarily get activated. It can be just a certain like, well, I used to not like that team, and they're still not one of my favorites, but they don't bother me near as much as they used to. Or it's with the teams that I did like. I mean, now uh, they just don't affect me. I'm not as hardcore of a fan about much of anything in life. And this all comes back around to the need to make a stand. And I think that's a huge separation between a mild preference and a resistance. When resistance comes in, there's this pull, this need to verbally or actively make a stand about it. And this is where people drain a lot of energy. They get in conversations that turn into debating or arguing, and nobody wins in these situations. So I think that's a great distinction between a mild preference and a resistance, is the activation of the emotions and the raised heart rate.
So when the emotions are activated, would you say that is it 100% of the time that resistance was at the beginning if we do trace it back? Or can there be emotional reactions that don't start with resistance?
Yeah, I think that it would be useful to view it as like resistance and preferences being uh, maybe cousins or brothers and sisters. Like they're very connected. And I feel that the majority of the time when people are experiencing resistance, it started with a preference. And then like it either escalated from another person being involved, that the preference turns into a resistance at some point. And potentially that turning point is when the emotions get involved. Again, a preference of, well, I like Pittsburgh Steelers, and somebody else says, well, I like Dallas Cowboys. See, that much of a conversation can stay in preference. But then if that person goes to, okay, look, judging the, say, Pittsburgh Steelers over the last 10 years or something, and then trying to degrade championships that they won. See, then that's the tendency for the one that likes Pittsburgh Steelers to start to defend. And now you're starting to offend me because you won't show respect to a preference that I have. This is a big key. So see, when people don't feel like their preference is being respected, then that's when it can turn into resistance and that need to prove a point. Once you have a need to prove a point, you've gone beyond preference. And I would say that's when it steps into resistance. Again, see, if both parties just say, well, I like the Pittsburgh Steelers, well, I like the Dallas Cowboys, hey, high five. There's no resistance in that. Normally, that turns into resistance due to elongated conversations about opposing dualities, rather than being able to see it from what we talk about, the polarity view of, well, there are many different teams, and there has to be fans of all of those teams or they wouldn't exist. So the idea of me allowing my preference to turn into resistance is ludicrous when you look at it from the conscious standpoint. And but see, normally when emotions get involved, the consciousness leaves. I still suggest that it's possibly impossible to be emotional and conscious simultaneously. Those are two different choices of an experience.
So now if we bring in like trauma, like childhood trauma, if somebody is being triggered in the moment and it's a childhood trauma, is it resistance to something that the trauma created and the resistance is the beginning point of that trigger? And I'm asking because in my own work, I worked on being present with my emotions, tracing them back, and the more work I've done, it feels like resistance there's always a point where resistance starts, like, right before my emotions are activated, like, you could feel that resistance come in. And then
Right.
if I, don't pause or don't remove myself from the situation to then look at that resistance, it will continue to build until the emotions come out.
Yes. Yes, and that's very, very common. And recognizing that resistance and being able to remove yourself from the situation and go into some stillness to be with that resistance. This is where we say, make love with the friction of life. Let's see if you can sit with that resistance and do the process. Of course, it helps to trace it back where it began. That's very important in the true wellness side of it. But in that initial moment, to look for the ridiculousness of allowing this subject to put me into this level of friction is very useful. And like I said with the sports teams, we're talking about two teams. I don't know how many football teams there are, maybe 24 or something. I don't really have any idea,
32.
but 32. Okay, so let's go with 32. So there's 32 teams out there, and they have to have fans or they can't exist. So, see, this is a conversation that I have with myself, and you're just talking to one fan of another team, and you're allowing them to upset you because you're defending to this one team when there's 32 teams out here. See, that kind of conversation with myself can actually bring comedy in, and I can laugh out loud. And then I can go re engage in that same conversation from a different mindset. See, I leave the resistance and now I realize, okay, I've just got this preference. And then I can take it to another step or preference of this team. And then the next step is, oh, well, I can even let go of this preference. I mean, I'm really not as tied into this team as I used to be. So, as a matter of fact, go ahead and say whatever you want to about the team. I'm not going to be offended at all. And see, the experience doesn't have to change. The perception of the experience is what changes that experience. And that's why I say it's very useful when you're able to remove yourself. And if you catch the resistance early enough or the preference, see, the preference is the first thing to catch. Oh, I've got a preference here. And if this conversation keeps going, it might turn into resistance. See, that's what you want to be prepared for. As soon as the resistance comes in, excuse me, I need to go be alone for about 15 minutes. And then you go sit in that resistance. And then you find the ridiculousness of it by using the mind as a tool in that way. And this is what the five pillars are for. We talk about the five pillars constantly. And going through those five pillars helps to bring back into center the conscious eye or the adult inside of us, realizing that the emotions are just like children inside of us. And they don't need to be fixed. They don't need to be healed. They just need to be managed differently. And as soon as you manage those differently, you can go plug back into the exact same conversation with the exact same person and it not affect you at all. And that is the one of the biggest purposes of this philosophy is that when you get it down to where you can do it in a matter of 5 to 15 minutes. In the beginning, you may need days to do this kind of processing, but that's normally because the person didn't catch that they were having a preference. And then it goes into full blown resistance and the emotions get activated. And once all of that happens, see, it may be too late to go through those steps that I was just talking about. Now you got to go through different steps and then connect it to traumas and things like that to find a better resolve for it. But this is the purpose of learning to live in non-preference, and that was a good example of how to practice non-preference.
And we're going to get into how to, help yourself along the way if you do discover that you're in resistance, or even after you're in an emotional reaction, how to process all of that emotion, and then get down to that root cause, which would be the resistance, and then trying to find other perspectives and other ways to look at those things to help alter that resistance and allow the energy to flow. But one more thing before we transition is a lot of people go throughout life or just on a daily basis, and I found myself doing this as well, where when you would ask somebody, how are they feeling? They'll say they feel fine. But when you actually, look at yourself and tap in, like you don't feel free. Like there's just a little bit of heaviness in your chest. And that's kind of my key to pause and, really dig through what is it that I'm in resistance to currently? Because we always have things in the back of our mind kind of eating at us and draining our energy. And this is a big part of why we want to root out the resistances in our lives because they are energy drains. And if we're wanting to live in wellness, which is what this life philosophy is all about, then we need to be conscious about where we have resistance. So there are days where I'll just realize that I'm just not grounded enough, and I have like this little pull on me, and so I'll have to really just start processing and trying to dig through where this is. And usually it's just like a thought that I'm worrying about, where I don't have a solution because I didn't give it enough time to root out, okay, well, here's my worry. And what's the worst case scenario if my negative thinking goes this way, which is really what the energy drain is, where I haven't put enough time into trying to find a different perspective or a different solution to allow the energy to flow so that my resistance is gone, and then that's no longer an energy drain. And part of it is like almost like preparation too, depending on what it is. If I'm not prepared enough, then it's just a worry. And when we're going throughout our busy lives, sometimes we just build up all these things that we're like we'll get to later, and then we forget to get to them, and then they're just always there running in the background like a background process on a computer.
Yeah, so well said, and that is why I feel like, the majority of our population, certainly our culture, is, so stressed, is that they have all of these partially worked out segments that they haven't resolved, but they've just, added another tab, so to say, like on a computer. And there's going to be limits on the computer to how many tabs open before it starts to slow down the mechanism. And our brain is very similar to that. So again, this is where we're going to bring in the 5 levels practice, to why stillness, meditation, spiritual practice, energetic practice, emotional practice, and physical practice, all 5 of those levels practiced every day helps to keep that clear, so to say, because if you whether you do it at night or in the mornings, when I choose to do it, or whenever you do it, to take time to see, to be with, just to be with the issue or the situation, rather than always trying to solve it. See, for some people, it's just go be with it and see what comes. And this is so hard for our linear, world, to get, because we're so solution oriented, and many times the solution is searching for the solution is part of the resistance. You're just resisting. Hey, like you said, enough time hasn't passed yet. So just be with it and stop trying to be the solution finder. And this is where in the philosophy we talk about the judge and the investigator, and that we were so trained in our culture to be the judge, when the investigator is the one that finds out all the solutions, not the judge. The judge many times don't have enough information. They're just judging on preferences many times. And that's very different from managing something when you have the full information, and you're coming from a place of knowing rather than a fear of not knowing enough. And so I think that's a very important differentiation. And for people dealing and working with this resistance thing, to see that, yes, these preferences are concerned, traumas from the past are concerned. There are many variables in all of this, but that just keeping a background log of unresolved issues because something else will happen during the day and somebody will go, well, this is more important than what I just had my mind on. But they don't tend to go back and visit stillness at any time and just revisit those programs that popped up or those issues that popped up and just be with them. And I have found being a perfectionist the majority of my life and wanting to find answers is what created me to be the student that I was, to read so many books over a 10 or 12-year period. And then now to be in a point to where I wanted to go 10 to 12 years without studying anything else and only practicing what I had learned. And that is a processing that I feel once again can be useful to people. Many times people are looking to learn new stuff before they hone what they've already learned. And that's where wisdom comes in, and difference between wisdom and intellect. The intellect's never going to finish learning. And I had a client the other day that mentioned that they look at learning like living, and if they were not learning, they're dying. And it's not that I opposed that or had resistance to that view, but I just suggested, what if you replaced growing instead of learning? Because see, growing is multidimensional, it's multi levels. Learning is a mental thing. And that's what we're caught in. We're trying to learn new stuff rather than growing all 5 of our levels simultaneously. And she happened to resonate with that. And so I wanted to share that because many people talk about being a student and talk about I'm always learning. But see, learning doesn't equate to doing, and the experience comes from doing. So play around with that. I'm always growing and I'm always looking to grow. And I think that it goes a lot further.
Yeah, because learning seems to be mostly in the mental, and then we're learning a lot of how other people would do stuff. And again, like we're all made differently, so we may not need all that information. And then when you do it, then you can see what information you needed to actually know, and then you can empty the rest and make room for other stuff.
Yes. Yeah. So again, the work is really in the emptying rather than the gaining. And that's what the wise, I feel like, figure out. They stop looking to put stuff in and they start emptying all this baggage and trauma and these types of things that are dictating people's preferences, which activates their resistance. And it's a brutal concept that most people just aren't aware of. Most people feel that their emotions are just like who they are. And I still stand by the understanding that no, emotions are taught and resistance is taught. And we learn that through our childhood and through our environments and that type of thing. And that's why a lot of the Just Philosophy's view of self development is in the releasing rather than the learning.
All right. So we ran a little bit long in this free version, but just want to thank you guys for joining us, and definitely check out our back catalog, which will include the second half of this complete conversation. We will see you on that side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this free version of the Wise podcast. To hear the complete conversation and go deeper into the application of the tools and techniques of the Just Philosophy, head on over to wisewisepodcast.com and become a premium member. You'll get to hear all of our complete conversations, including the complete episodes of our Inward Journey story series and our entire back catalog, and continue your self-development journey with us. We honor your dedication to self-growth, overall wellness, and continuing to ask the wise.
And remember, gradual changes over long periods of time equals lasting results.
Continue on your self-growth journey by visiting thejustphilosophy.com, where you are able to connect personally by booking a private consultation with Alexander in person, by phone, or Zoom. Uncover your authentic self more easily with a human design or destiny card consultation. Here you will gain information about your energetic makeup, personality, and your higher self, as well as navigating your way through your relationships. There are also multiple types of reports available for purchase that help you gain insight into your career, relationships, and opportunities for self growth. The site also allows you to view a calendar of Alexander's live performances and class schedule, peruse other products such as shirts, CDs, and finally, the revolutionary VibroTune vibrational sound therapy tables. These contoured therapy tables allow you to bathe in a vibrational sonic bath of frequencies, bringing you into alignment on all levels. You will be feeling and hearing calming music synced through vibration and frequency. So again, you can grab all this goodness at thejustphilosophy.com, thejustphilosophy.com. The Just Philosophy, as discussed in this podcast, has been developed by Alexander over the last 25 years in his personal studies, private practice, and professional environment. The information discussed is intended for educational purposes only and is not meant as a replacement for conventional medicine. Just remember, knowledge plus experience equals wisdom. Seek the wise. We want to thank you for working on you. Keep shining your light and refining your vibe.